Howdy, 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 this is Ryan Acid Murphy coming to you with another edition of Smarking Off. And this time we're going to be talking about, is pro wrestling a sport? Can it be a sport? Is it real? Well, before we can determine whether or not it is a sport, we have to decide what a sport is. And the more you look into it, the more you realize that when most people use the word sport or sports, it's more of a subjective thing than an actual standard thing, something that actually exists. There's really no such thing as a sport. That may sound insane, but let me explain. For starters, the oldest definition of sport comes from a French word meaning leisure, is just anything humans find amusing or entertaining. So, if you want to go far enough back, it really is anything. It can be a sport. But, you move to modern times, and most people would say it has to be it's an athletic competition. A sport is an athletic competition. Well, there's a lot of athleticism in pro wrestling, and there's a hell of a lot of competition. It just doesn't happen to take place during the matches. Except, of course, that they will compete to see who can have the best matches on the card. They'll compete over who can get the best audience reaction. So there's lots of different types of competition going on in pro wrestling. So since if all you're going to say is a sport is an athletic competition, you're not specifying when either of those things necessarily has to be taking place, then yeah, pro wrestling's a sport. And if you're suddenly going to try and change your definition and be more specific just to exclude pro wrestling, well, you're being a fucking prick. You're being biased. And again, I ask you, why do you feel a need to exclude pro wrestling? What is it about pro wrestling that hurts you so much, and it offends your ego so much that you feel a need to put it down and feel superior to it? Because that's really all it comes down to. Most of the time you find what people will call sports, and especially when they attack pro wrestling, it's about ego. It's a form of snobbery. Some reason pro wrestling just offends them and hurts them. Pro wrestling must have pissed in their cornflakes at some point, because they just cannot allow it to be its own thing and feel a need to attack it and bash it just so they can feel superior, because they're fucking snobs. But again, let's look at sports. So, let's consider the athletic part of that. Again, I'm going to go with the most commonly held concept of what a sport is, that it's an athletic competition. Well, motorized sports aren't particularly athletic. Lots of things like billiards are called sports that have no athleticism, and animal-based sports like equestrian, horse racing, dressage, jumping, whatever, aren't athletic. They're athletic for the horse, not so much for the rider. There's physical exertion involved in some of these cases, but not particularly being athletics. Considering that the primary qualification for being a good horse, a good jockey, is being small. Very, very small. And of course, there are some places that include strategy games like chess as sports, mind sports. And other people will say, well, no, that can't be a sport because it's not athletic. But then, of course, these other things that aren't actually athletic either can be sports. It's incredibly subjective and snobbish, the more you look at it and can think about it. And some people might say, well, the real key to it being a sport is that it has to be that the people involved are in control of their own fate. So, if you have two teams competing with each other, like in American football, actual football, what we call soccer here, which is actually a legitimate name. It was the name of the association for that particular game in England, and then that name got shipped over here. England started calling it football. We stuck with soccer. So it's still a completely valid name for that particular activity. We didn't change. England did. Not that that really matters. The point is that people will say, so, the two teams are, or in the case of like combat sports, they'll say, it's two fighters. It's the skill versus skill. Not in the case of anything that's judged. Think about it. Even in combat sports, boxing, MMA, there are judges. And the thing about judging is there really are no hard standards in any sport for judging. There's always an element of subjectivity. It's not in the hands of the people competing. It's in the hands of the judges and their subjective viewpoints. So, if you're going to try to make that argument, out the window, sorry. You're not thinking in terms of all the things that are called sports. And what about competition? Well, sport fishing just means you're catching big fish, usually oceanic fish. There are fishing competitions, but those are called fishing competitions. It doesn't it doesn't suddenly become a sport just because you're competing with other people. It's called sport fishing. And freshwater fishing competitions are just called fishing competitions. They aren't called sports. Hunting is called a sport, whether or not there's a competition involved. You have to ask yourself, when does something stop being a game and start being a sport? Because honestly, even boxing and MMA are games, because there are rules. They aren't fights. Real fights have no rules. They're games. Just because it's a game where you beat people up does not make it less of a game. When does it stop being a game and start being a sport? When does something stop being a sport and become a game? Is it because there has to be competition, or does there have to be something on the line that you're trying to win? There's no such thing as a sport. It's just a concept, an idea. And unfortunately, most people use that idea for their own gratification, to stroke their own egos as a form of snobbery. And so the things that they like can be sports, and anything they don't like is not. And honestly, I make fun of dressage a bit, but it's horse dancing. I know where it originated, but we don't have horseback battles anymore, so it's just horse dancing now. And honestly, if horse dancing can be a sport, then so can pro wrestling. But ultimately, pro wrestling is about storytelling. It's the middle ground between a sport and theater. It doesn't need to be competitive, although it is very competitive in various ways, as I've already said. It doesn't matter if pro wrestling is a sport, because it isn't trying to be one. Not in the sense that the assholes that want to bash it are using the word. They just can't accept it for what it is, for some reason. Their own insecurities, their own need to stroke their own egos and try to feel superior to other things because they're pathetic, ultimately, is all it comes down to. So is pro wrestling a sport? Yes, no, it doesn't fucking matter. And if it does matter to you, there's something fucking wrong with you. You're being a little baby. Grow the fuck up. So, can it be a sport? In the true sense. Not the subjective, conceptual sense that I've been talking about. Proper sport, like, an Olympic event. Sure, include judges. Again, make it like gymnastics. create a standard for judging it the best you can, and allow the judges to judge the matches and score them. Suddenly pro wrestling is a legit sport. So if you wanted to go there, I don't know what the point would be, since that, it's supposed to be about storytelling, not competing with each other. But since they compete over like Meltzer ratings or whatnot anyway, go ahead and try it if you want, if you're a promotion. And you can say that you are an actual sport. Then once you've gone through the hassle of getting a commission involved in all that shit, then you can feel real proud of yourself. So is it real? Again, what is real? Are movies real? By what sub-criteria are we asking what is and isn't real? Did any of the things that happen in a movie take place? Actually, yes, they did, unless they're all CGI. It just depends on the movie. If a stunt took place, then a stuntman had to go through, or a stunt woman had to go through the physical event. Just because they were protected doesn't mean they didn't go through something, and people do die making movies. So again, it's by what criteria are we asking what is and isn't real? What aspect are we talking about? The same is true of pro wrestling. Do they get bumped around all the time? Yes. Do they get hurt all the time? Do people die in pro wrestling? Yes, it has happened on several occasions. Do people get seriously injured in pro wrestling? Yes, people have had their lives seriously impacted. Necks broken, backs broken, muscle injuries, bone damage, nerve damage. You name it, it's happened in pro wrestling. So, on again, what level are we saying, is it or isn't it? Is it not real? Do they go out and work a match to a predetermined outcome? Yes. But so does every gymnast. They have a routine that they work. They're judged on how well they perform that routine. Same is true like a figure skating. There's quite a few Olympic sports. Very competitive, incredibly athletic, but they're not random. So again, if you're going to try and determine whether or not something is or isn't a sport based on randomness, not all sports have that either. And you say, well, no, that's not random, it's skill. Yes, it is random. It doesn't matter how good you are. You cannot always predict exactly where a ball is going to go. And I'm going to talk about this more in the MMA thing, about how pro wrestling and MMA, boxing and MMA, about randomness in that regard as well. But there's a hell of a lot of randomness in sports. But not all of them. Like I said, anything that involves doing a routine is about trying to do a routine perfectly. There's still randomness involved there. All it takes is one tiny miscalculation that you have no real control over, and you're fucked. So, again, what criteria are we talking about? What aspect of a certain thing are we talking about when we ask, is it real? Is it a real competition in the ring during the matches? No. But it was never trying to be. It was trying to tell a story. Now, it's trying to make you believe it's real, just like movies do. That's called suspension of disbelief. And again, I don't understand the disconnect there with people who actually seem to think that pro wrestling is trying to trick you or something. They weren't trying to trick anyone at any point in time, because the whole point was to make it more dramatic and therefore more entertaining. They made more money by becoming more entertaining to people. both sides win. It's not about trying to trick people. It's not a fix in the way that fixing a boxing match is fixed, which is usually about gambling and making more money for people and fucking over the audience. Pro wrestling isn't about fucking over the audience. It's about making things bigger and more entertaining and everything for the audience. Again, theater meets sports. So again, I don't know how much of this is simply not understanding what pro wrestling actually is and what it's trying to do. How much of it is just sheer snobbery and insecurities, apparently. I don't understand that impulse to attack pro wrestling, to try and prop up your own ego. In the case of people who do that sort of thing, I don't understand it. It's like, they don't attack movies and TV shows and other forms of fiction, but for some reason they get this hard-on for needing to attack pro wrestling to make themselves feel something. I don't know what exactly they're trying to get out of it. Being little babies is all it is. So yeah, you really stop and think about these things. Is it a sport? What's a sport? Yes, no, who cares? Can it be a sport? Yes, very easily. Just to have judges and judge the matches as either routines like in gymnastics or simply on their quality. And suddenly it's a sport. By most accepted criteria, it would be a sport at that point. And is it real? Again, and what criteria are we asking? What aspect are we asking about? What happens in the ring isn't really trying to be real in the sense that people are talking about. It's supposed to be, they're telling a story. But everything that happens to them, one way or another, is actually taking place. So, again, most of this is just people being dicks. Childish little pricks. More than anything, but there you have it. It all really comes down to your subjective point of view, and ultimately, it doesn't fucking matter because pro wrestling is a form of storytelling and isn't trying to be real. It's trying to tell you a story, but in order to tell that story at its best, it tries to look real. Within its own logic. Because just like any form of fiction, pro wrestling has its own logic. So, thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.